What's going on YouTube? Earth Power here with CVH.
How's it going?
We are here to discuss the future of Channel Earth Power, namely the Finish Meta bracket tournament that Spencer had a lot of words to use, but you'll hear that in later videos. But it's our bracket tournament. So a couple of disclaimers first. A little bit of housekeeping. We are using a Finish Meta ban list that we mentioned in the previous video. CVH will have it pulled up on screen now. It's the limit of Slash Charger, Soul Swap, and Future Slash to 2, and the limiting of Corile and Cranium Clamp to 1, as well as the ban of Bombazar, which we've pretty much done on this channel since its inception. So, using this ban list, CVH and I, as well as the rest of Team Peach, Gorby, and Spencer, put together a list of top 16 decks that we've been tinkering with off and on for probably the past 2 to 3 months. And then we just kind of culminated in this top 16 listing, which CVH will have pulled up now, and we will have made some changes to this, which we'll get into here momentarily as we just kind of discuss each of these decks and kind of how we rank them and how we feel about them moving forward
Yeah, I
in this
just now
bracket.
realized what you were saying, where this one is the outdated bracket, but it's so close to being
Yeah.
final.
It is close. There are some changes, and with some proper editing, you may even see it on this image where we've changed Fire Water Rush. That is now at spot 13, facing off against DekloTanz.
Light Fire
And
Rush
the
is just out of the bracket entirely. We decided to cut
Light
that
Fire
one.
Rush got pulled out, and then taking its spot against Marinomancer is a Light Dark Water Nature Mana Burn,
Yeah, the Fortress
which
Shell
we'll get
dot
into
deck.
here.
So yeah, in today's
Yes.
video, we're just basically going to go over the 16 decks that are actually in the bracket. So all of these minus Light Fire plus the Light Water Dark Nature Mana Burn control deck, and talk about why we chose them, how the group of the four of us sort of rated them power level wise, and just giving y'all some food for thought to speculate on how these matchups are going to go.
Yeah. So, what I initial thoughts on this is what I really liked and kind of what made it come together is shout out to Spencer. He was like, with all this creative energy, playing with this new band list, like the game feeling not new, but for lack of a better word, just new and refreshed. We started putting together these lists, and as we started doing it, we just started, well, we have this list now, we have this list, and eventually we just had 20 deck lists where we were like, oh, like all of these feel good and feel like they could compete. And Spencer was like, well, why don't we just have them compete? And so came the bracket tournament. You guys have seen this from us before. We've done the creative bracket in the past. We've done the standard bracket where I think Hydrooze ended up facing off against what was Bombazar at the time. I think because we did run Bombazar in that list, or maybe we ran something else in that list. But either way, Hydrooze ended up winning it.
Yeah,
And so,
Hydrooze. Woo!
say
I'm
that
just,
again. What?
I was like, yeah, Hydrooze, woo! Just
Oh yeah,
Hydrooze hype,
I thought you had words to use with it. But yeah, so we just kind of brought that back, and with this new ban list, a lot of these decks that were a little bit more niche in the past and might have fallen into the lower tier of that creative bracket back then, all of a sudden could compete with the standard decks like Fire Nature Water, foul control, the standard rubs that we used to play in the past could compete because now all of a sudden Cranium Clamp's limited to one. And turns out when you do that, other strategies become viable because they're not just getting obliterated in the hand. Combo pieces aren't being made to get rid of on turns 4 and 5. So Christian, I'm sure you could probably speak to this too. It's just it made the control strategies feel a little bit more human, and all of a sudden they had to start relying on things other than Clamp and Corile to win games, which just made every deck that didn't play those cards feel a little just, I don't know, standard, for lack of a better way of saying it.
Yeah, I totally agree. If you could talk for like another quick second, I'm going to actually get
Ah,
a non-deprecated version of the bracket on screen.
solid, solid. So yeah, so what was nice about the way this ended up working out was that we had a really good array of every archetype that Duel Master sees. So there's a couple of different Discord chats. Shout out to the IDC meta. I've pulled a lot of strategies from this. Shout out to the channel The Gauntlet, where we pulled some more deck lists and got some insight from some of the guys who are playing these decks very much more regularly than we were. A lot of these decks in this bracket for us, here's a little peek behind the curtain. Probably only saw 2 to 3 matches, if that, played against whatever we played them against before we actually just jammed them in this meta. So a lot of this was theory crafting for us. But one of the nice things that came about was that we just had a really good array of all the different archetypes, like I mentioned before. A decent, I think it's 4 to 5 different tempo decks. 3 to 4 or 2 to 3, hyper aggressive aggro decks, namely the Fire Nature Rush and the Fire Water Rush.
Yeah, I don't know if you
Decks
mentioned
that,
it, but originally we were planning on doing only 8 decks. So yeah, we just had like
yeah,
more than that we thought were kind of cool. We wound up like when we were trying to narrow it down to 8, we had like a solid 9 or 10 that were deserving in our eyes with our limited sample size, and it was just like, well, if we add another round, like the worst case scenario is like a couple decks might be a little low power, and then we just get to watch the more interesting good decks sort of feed on them and do what they do for one more game. But it does open the possibilities of underdog victories and some really interesting gameplay with cards that you don't normally see in what we considered the top tier meta of like the Faux Bombazar, Waterfire Nature, Rub decks, Marino decks, Wise Starnoid, Wave Strikers, decks that we've already played with. Now we get to play with cards like Aura Pegasus.
right. But then, I mean, the other side of that too is tuning these decks like Foul Control, like Marino, because of the banned cards. Marino used to run a full grip of Corile. Now it's down to one, so Marino has to do some other things. And
Yep.
you'll see it in the profile where, like, now we're adding a heavier initiate engine in that kind of in that deck, or not. Maybe sorry, Starnoid. I'm saying it's instead of running the full grip of Corile and Starnoid. But even Marino too, Marino ran, I think, multiple Corile, maybe it didn't, but taking
Yeah.
Clamp out of those control strategies, like now Phal and Rub have to find other things to do with that turn 4 slot. Rub was running multiple Coreals, now it's not.
Yeah, going
The
back to the
Declo
ban list, I mean, like we were never playing with Bombazar in our fun games because we wanted to have fun in our fun games.
Right,
So that wasn't really a change for us in our local meta, as you could call it. But Clamp and Swap, I think, are the big ones that I feel when we're playing.
right.
Because like the control, basically, if I were playing a real meta, like Bombazar and Clamp, I think are the two most busted cards in the game. Every deck that is good would probably play one or the other, or maybe even both. And Clamp on turn 4 is just demoralizing, especially if you know there's more, because you finally get 2 more cards in your hand. You're like, pressure, and then you get clamped. So it does make the control decks feel a lot more fair and gives a lot of mid-rangey decks a lot more room to fight.
Well, the idea too is that even in a meta that has 4 clamps, and it's weird to say meta, but stick with me, like you know the idea of 4 clamps that changes not only the decks that are running clamp but the decks that are playing against it, the combo strategies, like maybe now Pegasus has to run a water engine because it needs energy stream to stay alive. It needs to run multiple Pegasus because it couldn't afford to have them discarded early, and
Mhm.
if it did, you needed a way to be able to pull more for the strategy to go together. I look back at decks, and this one's not being played in this bracket, but we played Water, Fire, Dragons in the past on this channel. You can go find some matches with it and some profiles with it. Um, where that deck just had to run 4 Stream, 4 Bojula, 4 of all the big dragons. It couldn't play more techie cards, or at least if it did, we weren't. It against a 4 clamp meta, those decks had to play those cards that kept them in the game because a clamp could just ruin that deck outright on 4. And when there were 4 of them, you had to bank on seeing it on 4, so you had to play the deck around it, if that makes sense. So seeing and to mention back and circle back to what you were saying, Soul Swap at 2, like Soul Swap makes a lot of these strategies very viable. All of a sudden, it kind of makes them kind of more, it brings them more down to earth too. And I'm going to keep harping on Pegasus because it's at the top of this list here in this bracket that I'm looking at right now. But like Soul Swap at 2, all of a sudden you're still playing your angel commands. You're still playing the Horn Beast engine stuff, and you'll see it in the profile. But now a Soul Swap at 2, you're kind of you're not limiting yourself, but you're playing maybe more of some of the more standard cards to kind of keep them in that match. Whereas, if you have a full grip of Soul Swap, and you'll see it with the Fire Water Nature tempo for sure, running the bigger guys like Twin Cannon and, Jigalzor and some of the bigger cards that deck runs once you take Bombazar out, putting Soul Swap at 2 maybe means you don't run 4 Twin Cannon, or you don't run 3 to 4 Jigalzor. You limit those down and play more into your mid game. Because Soul Swap's at 2, you can't reliably get those beat sticks out that you would need otherwise when you're burning your hand early to maintain tempo.
Yeah. So yeah, going into it, I mean, it's been also really inspiring to look at the deck lists that are being played overseas by not only the Finnish format people, but also there's the IDC tournaments that use a similar ban list, not identical, and I think they switch their format kind of regularly, but they don't use the 40 card maximum either. But if you have a local play group and a bunch of Duel Masters cards, you probably don't have as many cards as Carl has behind him right now. But try either this format or like try mixing it up. You don't need to use the maximum if you don't want, but like it really did breathe a lot of fresh air into the game. And I mean, we're pretty much almost done recording the bracket tournament as of the time of filming this, and I'm still very excited to play more. And we'll probably, if this is received well and you guys like it, might even bring it back, add some decks, swap them around, edit some stuff. But do you want to jump into some lists and show them what actually we landed on?
Right. So my last piece before we jump into that is something we haven't really mentioned. We mentioned the ban list, but I think the 40 card max min deck, where it was just 40 cards and that was the deck limit, that changed things considerably too for us. It made us all of a sudden have to strict to very tight uh just card limits on what we were running. In the
Yeah,
past you could run a 50 card, a 54 card dirtle deck, and especially with like Deckout and stuff like that, you could just run those decks big, play 4 of the slash charge or future slash, and just let the deck be a dirtle deck. But
yeah.
when you limit everything to 40, it kind of puts things on a different clock, and so
And
that
we
was
weren't
something that was fun to
we
play with.
weren't about to play like Faux Bombazar, Hydrooze, or Rush at like 44 cards because we've sort of evolved as card game players in the last 2 decades since you probably first started seeing our content. But yeah,
It's
for any sort of control deck, um, not only is it relevant in like sometimes you'd actually want to have like between 45 50 cards, and a lot of the ones in the IDC format that don't have that limit do play 50 cards, not only because of the flexibility and the search these decks have and the time they give themselves, but also because like yeah, if you're really going slow, especially against another control deck in a mirror match, it starts to matter how many cards left you have in your deck, and decking out's a real thing. So like if I could just play as many as I wanted, most of these decks would stay at 40. But yeah, something like the Mana Burn deck or the Phal deck would almost definitely run more than 40, and I think be correct there. So it was like you said, it's interesting trying to like really hone it down to the necessary components there, and play 3 ofs when you would play 4 ofs, and 1 of when you would play 2 ofs, and just sort of rely on
It
the
just
search and
adds a layer
flexibility.
to the meta. It just adds a layer in terms of just the clock that you're playing on. Like the mana burn, and I guess we can get into this now if you want to start looking into some of these decks, and we can start with mana burn because this was one of the newer strategies, I think. And again, not to put words into Christian's mouth, but this was one of the newer strategies and a card that before 3-4 months ago, I don't know that you or I had ever played it in a deck. Um, so Fortress Shell just against all of these other decks, especially some of the more tempo-y strategies and some of the mid-range strategies. Like this deck doesn't have a true finisher. So knowing when to attack and when to start attacking is such a big deal. And Fortress Shell puts them on this weird clock where all of a sudden you've got them down to 4 or 5 mana maybe when you play your first Fortress Shell or Miraculous Plague. So if you have dudes that can swing, you kind of have a general idea of what they're going to crack back with based on the mana you're putting them at and what you're limiting them to based on the colors you're removing. So this deck at 40 cards, if you dirtled for too long because of all the search, because of all the draw that this deck can generate, all of a sudden you're at 5 to 6 to somewhere between 5 and 6 and 8 and 9 cards in your deck, And if you haven't started breaking or you're not in a position to start breaking, this deck just loses because it can't maintain at that point.
Yeah.
Your opponent just has to keep you from attacking for 4 to 5 more turns, and maybe you'll just lose that way. So it's an
Yeah, this
interesting
was
piece that the 40 card meta brought into this with
I,
newer strategies.
yeah, I remember calling you and Spencer up separately and like trying to, because we had already rated the decks and like built a bracket, and I was exploring the Discord you sent me to with the IDC players, which again they use a different, they don't use our ban list. They use there's definitely 4 swaps, and I believe often there's more than one clamp. I don't know, they might, you know, sometimes limit it to 1 or 2. I do believe that if you could play more than 40 cards and clamp and swap were both at 4, this deck becomes, as long as Bombazar is banned, I think it becomes solid A plus tier, because of the flexibility those 2 cards allow and the power level. Because at the end of the day, this deck does something that is the most powerful thing you can do in any card game, which is prevent your opponent from playing the game. And in the hands of a skilled player, and it is quite hard to play, you can tech it for a variety of matchups as you can pretty much any control deck. The lack of mass removal is really its only downfall, but Miraculous Plague does a lot of the heavy lifting there. So yeah, I was really excited that we got to put this deck in there. It even has the Shield Regeneration and Sky Sword, that I think is a card that we underrated a lot in our previous games in years past on the channel. It's in a couple decks in this bracket. But I just
Very
knew
much.
there was no question in my mind when I saw all the IDC players playing this that like there had to be a 40 card version that was worthy of at least being slotted in and like maybe losing round 1 or something at the very least. So you had to see how it did, right? It's too popular in the overseas metas to ignore.
Yeah, for sure. And again, shout outs to the IDC Discord and all those guys over there that are constantly running tournaments month in and month out. But they, they just have a lot of numbers from their past 2+ years of putting tournaments and stuff together in a ranking system very similar to what Corey over at the Kaijudo channel did for us with Kaijudo, where they just jam these decks constantly. And so they have so many statistics on how these decks finish, how they're rated, how they're ranked based on all their players that are playing. And I mean, they're getting 15 plus players in their tournaments monthly when they're doing these. I watched them just put together their first tournament of the year this year for 2023, and they had a ton of guys sign up and play. And I'd be lying if I told you what finished because I don't follow the stats at that point. But they jam a lot of games, and this deck was in their top 4 over the course of 2 years, which just tells you something. Whether or not you think it's good or not, people are playing it and it's doing well.
Yeah.
So,
It tells you
there's
that
something.
they should probably limit Soul Swap to 2. In my humble opinion. I don't know.
So, to start back, I guess at the just looking at, and I gotta pull it back up again.
The
Um,
bracket?
so yeah, so a lot of this started for us, and Christian can tell me what the timestamp looks like, but a lot of this started for us with, so that I'm not rambling too long, Christian, but
Yeah.
um, the rock, paper, scissors, where we landed, which sort of started this for us right before Thanksgiving when, we were just starting to get like ramping back into just playing these games, and Spencer and Christian are back closer and local again. Wave Strikers, Deckout, Survivors.
Which, by the
We
way,
put
was a
those,
completely different rock paper scissors than we were expecting. we were
yeah.
The decks that we thought were good prior to that were like Water Dark Fire Controller, maybe Phal, Water Fire Nature, Faux Bombazar Midrange, and of course like a straight up rush deck, right? Like Fire Nature or something.
Right.
But needless to say, we played some other stuff, and I think it started with Deckout and Survivors, right? Because I saw a Deckout deck from one of the.
Yeah. Well, so it started. Deckout was the first one that came along because we've tinkered with that in the past. So Deckout was still a strategy, and because of our limited list, it just kind of made Slash Charger and Future Slash seem more appealing because why would you limit them? And that this is the only deck that basically plays them for the most part.
Should I bring it up?
I think that was, yeah. So looking at deck out, and this list that I think I have pictured here is way different than the one we ended up, I think, finally landing on because of
Oh
just,
yeah, isn't it? Yeah. The list, there
there's
is
the,
a list that is more accurate, like above it, right?
yeah.
Then you correct the actual deck list.
I Did I correct the actual numbers? I think I did. I think those numbers are correct
Yeah,
at the
that the
top.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just use that list then. I'll crop my thing very weirdly. Hope you enjoy this crop, YouTube. It looks pretty awful, right? Leave a comment
Yeah.
down below if you've made it this far and you've seen my terrible crop.
Oh, so the point of this list was again just to dirtle. It's just the Deckout's whole idea is that if it can just one, it's going to one for one better than any other deck in the meta. So if you can get your opponent down to top decking, this deck in theory should be able to top deck to kill everything you play. And that was the whole theory. And just do that for 30 turns and you win. Because eventually this deck will play Slash Charger and or Future Slash and take you off of cards because this deck will never draw more than one card for its turn every turn. So,
Yep.
Deck Out in this meta was supposed to be the best of all of the quote unquote control decks. And then Survivors, which was a deck that we pulled from the IDC group. Again, something we've tinkered with in the past, but I'd always played these 4-color, 5-color monster, massive 50 plus card survivor decks, and they weren't ever that good because you never saw the survivors when you wanted them to. So all of a sudden you take survivors and put a bunch of grave worms and fortress shells in, and they're just these floaters that are also just a problem because they get the effects from all of the other ones, and that gave Deck Out a really bad time. All of a sudden, Deck Out couldn't deal with, Slash Charger could throw a Grave Worm into mana, but then you just get it back with another Grave Worm, and Deck Out could never hit your hand and your graveyard at the same time, or hand and field at the same time, so Survivor's just won as long as it held a Grave Worm, and it just sort of outpaced them at that point because you could just multiply very quickly because that's what Survivors did. So that's what started the rock paper piece.
Yeah.
And
And
then
granted, to that point,
you
Deck
and
Out had proven itself a little bit, like it had beaten, a rush deck handily, a control deck here or there, and all of a sudden it got, put up against Survivors and just sort of ran into a brick wall and Grave Worm.
yeah. So that's when we realized, oh, is this the meta? Is it Survivor's Deck Out? And all of a sudden, you and Spencer, we tinkered with the idea. We were just looking for other strategies that could be viable in this meta that we've sort of found for ourselves. And Wave Strikers came into play. I was like, well, this was a deck we put together again in the past, but we did it
Yeah.
with Killsteins and
You said, yeah, like Wave Strikers is the only thing
multiple.
we hadn't played, but it's bad because you have to play Killstein, right? And we were
Right.
for a little bit.
Yeah.
The
And then
origin
all of a
story
sudden
of
it was,
this, I
yeah,
was
you tell this. You and Spencer did this. Yeah,
it was 1 a.m., which is a great time to brew. I was playing
absolutely.
against something Spencer was playing. I was using the Wave Striker deck we had put together, which was totally different. And I just drew, you could say maybe like the wrong half of the deck, but it turned into the right half of the deck. Like I just drew only the 2 and 3s. I got like Cranium Clamped very early, so I didn't have enough gas to put stuff in mana and play stuff. So I was just like hard stuck on 3. But my turn 3 was a 3-drop. My turn 4 was a 3-drop. My turn 5 was another 3-drop. And it was like the easiest game I ever played of Duel Masters. It was crazy because everything was 6,000 power. And can't remember what Spencer was playing, but I realized at that point it's like a lot of decks can't answer like multiple 6,000 power creatures on turn 4. And that's kind of what this deck does. And if you do that, you really have very little reason to go above 3 mana, or at least not to 7, surely. Like you could play like a Skyscraper Shell or like a Goliath or something, but like this deck is never hitting 7 mana, at least in any sort of normal situation. So that was the idea. It was like, well, if we don't need to go to 7 to win games, why don't we just make it more consistent to get the curve we want early, cut the 7s, cut whatever 6s we were playing at the time, except for Holiaw, and just see how it works as like a pretty straightforward aggro deck that, starts breaking on turn 4 when everything's 6,000 power.
But it does aggro in such a different way where you have aggro, but it's 6,000 dudes with effects.
Yeah.
Because we jammed this against Fire Nature Rush, and it beat it handily because Azura is a 6 to 7,000 power blocker with Merlee on the board, and
Well, then
Sapient Heart
Fire
will
Nature wins if
never.
it goes first like half the time, right?
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes. But you have Sapient Tark, which can attack over untap things. All of your creatures get bigger on turn 4, which is the crackback turn for the against the rush deck. So, yeah, if you're going second, that can stink a little bit, but it was interesting to see this deck all of a sudden have the answers for the anti-tempo decks where it can beat Fire Nature Water because of Goliath and Skyscraper Shell. It can just keep them off of creatures and have the bigger dudes on turn 3 when you're still removing things. Pyrofighter is your fast attacker to, get you ahead when you need to get ahead. But this deck ran into the brick wall of Deckout because Deckout had the answers. All of a sudden, we realized, okay, Crimson Hammer is a card that just needs to be played because again, the meta is the decks you're playing against in your area, and turns out our area is just us. So
Yep.
okay, now all the cards that are playing fire and control need to run Crimson Hammer to a varying degree. Phal, Rub, Decloaz,
But turns out Crimson
not
Hammer
Mana
is just good, and we were kind of underrating it because it's like very good against
and
pretty much every aggro deck. And
right, but we were at the point to where, oh well, we know what Fire Nature does, so we're not going to play it. So we just sort of anti-meta'd ourselves and started taking it out of decks because we were just playing controls versus other control types or other combo decks because that's what we were trying to find fun on the channel back then. So
yep,
all of a sudden Crimson Hammer lost value because again, that's what happens. I guess that's how a meta works when you're not playing against those decks anymore. But now all of a sudden we have wave strikers on the field and it's a problem. And you need to be able to deal with them before they get large. And Crimson Hammer Spastic Missile do that. So Declowash just had a perfect matchup against wave strikers because it could just kill the dudes one at a time. And
yeah.
sure, wave strikers could dirtle for a dozen turns before it dropped a bunch of dudes all at once. But then you had Terrapit, you had all the other just removal without having to name them all. But Deckout just had a good matchup. So all of a sudden now we had the rock paper scissors. Survivors beats Deckout. Deckout beats Wave Strikers. Wave Strikers handles the mess out of Survivors
Mhm.
because all of its dudes are just bigger, faster.
But going back to the
So
bracket,
it's
I'm looking at the ratings right now. It wasn't like a true rock paper scissors. Like we knew other decks were part of it. Um, so again, Mana Burn being rated 14th was just because we put it into a slot that was already at that rating. We didn't actually have that in the list of decks when the four of us were, sort of doing our power
Mana Burn
rankings to
was
determine the
the
bracket.
last deck we added.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, again, we had not tested it, so it probably wouldn't have been like super high in the top four, but it would have been higher than 14th, almost definitely. Wave Strikers, we did believe pretty universally was like either the strongest deck or the second or third strongest, so it did wind up at number one. Deckout wound up sort of in the middle of the pack because we thought it had pretty polarizing matchups, but totally crushed a lot of things. And even though
Yeah.
Survivors beat Deckout handily, I believe we thought it had like general inconsistencies, and we couldn't really settle
Yeah.
on the exact build. So it wound up in like the bottom 8, but there are other decks that are sort of in the mix as well. It wasn't like
Yeah.
these three are
And
just the top 3.
for sure. But I mean, to talk about where this kind of bracket started was those were the decks that kind of made us realize, oh, this Duel Masters can be much different with this ban list because these decks are now very viable. And they probably were viable in the past with 4 clamps and 4 Corile and all the other things, but like now they just felt better
Mhm.
because you didn't have to worry about a consistent turn 4 clamp. So, starting from there,
I
we
say we
started
just I say we
retooling
just go
the
down.
old favorite.
Should we
Yeah,
do the old favorites,
so
or do you just want to go back down the bracket, like besides the ones we've already talked about, maybe hit up
yeah,
Pegasus next? 'Cause
yeah, for sure. So, Pegasus, which we spoke to a little bit earlier, um, was just that strategy. It's just a nature light Pegasus. Um, Cards that as we started to test this deck more without getting into kind of how it did and will perform in this bracket, but Alcadias is a very powerful card. Turns out, the 5-drop 7,000 power blocker is a big deal. That is a hard card to deal with just in general, and it's not something most decks want to terror pit or waste good one-for-one removal on, especially when that's so limited in some of these matchups. But then Alcadias just turns out a lot of these control decks just can't touch the card. So,
Yeah.
you know, in the past where Clamp, again, I will just keep mentioning it, Clamp at 4 ruined cards like Alcadias because it dealt with them before they were ever on the board.
Yeah, it kind of ruined
Um,
a lot of evolution based strategies.
yeah. So, you know, Pegasus now just in to me just felt viable. I was looking for other cards that weren't Starnoid from those Vortex evolutions that could be viable, and Pegasus was the one that came to mind because it was like, oh cool, I get to use some of the Angel Command support, but then all of the Horn Beast support. Ancient Horn the Watcher is just a neat card. So it just made this neat kind of combo deck come together with this massive evolution that, again, prior to this bracket tournament, I don't think we ever played on the channel.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that takes us to Foul Control, a deck that did see very much play on this channel. This is your baby, Christian. I'll let you take the reins.
It is. I do have to recrop it because Pegasus was another one of those decks that we changed last minute, and the list was right, but the picture wasn't. So
Yeah.
it's coming. You can kind of see the corner of Foul Control right now, and
No.
well, there it is. We got the whole deck on screen. Yeah, this was one that I was really high on leading up to even before we built the bracket up. I had originally a slightly dirtier list with more of the dragons like a Villarica and the Blomedius.
Yeah.
Spencer took it, and I think the only real meaningful change that he made, but it turned out to be quite meaningful, was swapping the finisher lineup to just 2 Bazas and 2 Cryptic Totems, with the idea that, you know, if you have all the time in the world, Cryptic Totem is just an easy way to win the game and make use of your sort of useless bodies like Bronze Arm Tribe and Phals on the board, because if you're playing Blomedius, you really
Right.
don't use them to much effect at that point. So Cryptic makes them useful. We have the double swaps and a lot of ways to get swap back from other places to make the finishers make more sense. And you can either 1 or 2 turn clock, depending on if you have a Bazagazil and other things on the board. Like, if you have enough removal, you can just go Cryptic and one other dude and just kill him in 2 turns. But yeah, this deck is
Yeah.
really cool. And again, it goes back to the lack of Cranium Clamp you'd think would make this deck worse, but it means we don't really have to run a water-based control deck with 4 energy streams because we're not
Right.
worrying about opposing clamps. So in
And you
reality, it
just
gave this deck a lot of strength.
and you just get to accentuate the toolboxness of it. Like, you know, you talk about toolbox decks. I think Foul and Survivors are the two that I go to, maybe DekloTanz, where the core of the strategy is to cycle spells. You know, with DekloTanz, it's to get off that combo, Dekloaz, Tanzanite. With Survivors, it's to do the Survivor thing. But those cards only make up, and the supporting cast of those cards only make up, you know, 20 to 24 cards of the deck that are standard, you know, where you want to play the 4 pits, you want to play the 4 of the certain survivors, you want to play the Decloaz and the Tanzanites, but everything else after that is just dealer's choice. You know, how do you tool this to do the best it can in the given meta? And Foul, I think, has just all of the answers because you can just play all of the one ofs that are good and see them consistently because of cards like Logic Cube. You can have them discarded early if your opponent does have the clamp because Foul will get them back. You know,
Yeah.
this deck just has all of the things it needs to, I think, just play well in a ban list version of this meta. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just Foul just felt good. Felt better than it ever felt prior to doing something like this.
Yeah, for me, it felt like the only deck that didn't have an obviously bad matchup. Because, you know, against
Right.
the slower mid-range and control decks, you ramp into Lost Soul. That's a game plan. Doesn't always work, 'cause you don't always see it, but, like, it has a plan against everything. It just needs to draw the right cards. The one thing I was concerned about that Spencer's Change sort of accidentally made less of a problem was, like, it plays against Deckout. Most of my deck is useless because it's about killing things that Deckout's not playing. But Bazagazil only gets dealt with by Cranium Clamp in Deckout. So you actually can just make sure you have 3 cards in your hand so you don't get clamped, and just Bazagazil them like 4 or 5 turns in a row until they finally lose. So
Yep.
that's a way to deal with Deckout.
12 hit Terror Pit and you're good. Yeah.
Yeah, Terrapit does kill it. A Proclamation of Death shield trigger would be probably the most demoralizing thing. Stay tuned to see if
That's
that
what's
matchup even happens.
you're right. That's why you always play a bronze arm trap before you play
Yeah,
a deck.
true. You gotta have
So
11 mana or 10. Yep.
that brings us to Starnoid. This deck got ranked, I think, higher than it probably should have.
Let's see
maybe
where it
by a
did get ranked.
solid four.
What did we put it at? Nine total. Yeah, that
We
was
ended
interesting.
it ended up at 9, but Gorby ended up voting this his number one overall, and I think that skewed the listing for it a little bit. But
Just a
Starnoid
smidge.
is I don't know. It's weird. So we've seen different lists like this in the past. We've played Alzonius on the channel. You can go back and watch those videos. We've obviously played Starnoid on the past in the past. This deck just kind of takes all of those different tempo strategies and puts it into one deck, um, with a craze engine because why not, right?
Yeah.
So
I like
this
that
was the
it's
deck.
probably the most viable Merfolk deck you might be able
Yeah,
to say because it can run a Sirion, which is a Cyberlord, right? Is it a Cyberlord? No, it's
it
not.
is.
It is.
Yes, Syrian.
Is
Yeah,
okay.
Syrian's a
Yeah, I
um,
thought it. Yeah. Okay.
right.
Thought I was just wrong.
So Starnoid basically the where this deck I guess got hit from that list was putting Corile at one. You know, a lot of the control decks will run the single of Corile, but now it's not so much as I'm chaining Corilles together to go for like a game win plan, like with Cryptic or like in some of the rub strategies with Bomidius. Starnoid just now lost one of its most prominent bait creatures. Or not Star. I keep saying Starnoid.
This is Starnoid. You're right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, so it lost one of its most prominent, bait and just kind of control pieces that kept this deck uh doing what it did after you drop Starnoid. So with that limit, all of a sudden, we now needed a way to make this deck, I guess, deal with control slightly better. While Starnoid's a great anti-aggro and anti tempo card because it can just play into those strategies, and it doesn't matter if your dudes are swinging on me. Once I drop Starnoid, the whole game shifts into my favor. Craze gave this deck its ability to deal with the heavier control strategies that were either dropping blockers or dropping bigger guys or problem cards and kept them in the game. So this deck saw quite a bit of changes that we didn't really get to test prior to putting into this bracket, but it still felt strong. And maybe you can speak to it a little bit better, but Starnoid was one of those decks that I didn't have a ton of experience with outside of posting the channel videos, but I can't say that I ever played with this deck that much.
Yeah, I think two things come to mind. We were just really high on shield regeneration because at the time where we built Starnoid years and years ago, we didn't really value Skysword highly. So I think we kind of viewed this as like our only Andromeda equivalent from Kaijudo.
Right.
Obviously weaker, but it was like, ooh, it feels cool to have more than 5 shields, or at least to be able to get them back. So I get why it was rated highly by Gorby, especially. I don't know about number one is optimistic, but I understand why you rated it highly, especially because this was one of the decks that often got hurt by that turn 4 clamp, and that's much less likely now. And so, you could say that maybe that's a more of a benefit than limiting Corile as a detriment. So I kind of get it, but it's a overall like the card quality is good. It runs a lot of good water and light cards that hopefully curve into either Starnoid or Craze, and has good board presence. So just a pretty generally good mid-rangey sort of deck that can play
Yeah,
defensively.
for sure. And we'll definitely see it more on the channel as we go along because I think this deck deserves being played differently throughout. So, this is one of those decks where I look at this list and I know that it can be refined better.
Hmm.
And I'm just wondering, as we go along in the future, what this deck will look like as we go.
Yeah, the Craze
Because I think
edition was super last minute. We didn't even test that at
right,
all.
right. So, light water in general, I think offers itself all of the different strategies, whether you want that to be tempo, whether you want that to be control, whether you want that to be more defensive, more aggressive. These two colors just allow themselves a lot of flexibility. And, this is why decks like Alzonius played these colors as well, because you could just run the Alzonius engine and then just support it with anything else around that, whether that be servers, defensive cards or whatever. So I'm just interested to see what this deck looks like as we continue on. But without further ado, that brings us to DekloTanz, another one of your babies, Christian. I'll let
Back to
you take.
control. Yeah, as you can see in the bracket, we landed on having two Water Dark Fire control decks, sort of a classic variant that we just called Rub, which is funny to me because it's the only time we use the colors instead of
Yeah,
the civs, which
right.
bothers the shit out of me, I've got to say, but just because you asked me to.
You're the one who put different styles of cards in at the same time, like
What do you mean? Oh yeah, yeah,
Japanese
yeah, yeah,
crystal
yeah, yeah,
memories,
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
alternate art crystal memories, regular English
Wouldn't
crystal
be if
memories.
you
Like,
just if you owned all of one language, we wouldn't have this problem in the first place. But I like DekloTanz. I think it is a modern take on an old classic, and I just kind of like if I'm playing a control deck, Carl, I've got all day. You know, give me the slowest, give me the
well,
slowest, grindiest win condition.
you've got at most 30 turns, but yeah.
Okay, yeah, but I will make those turns very painful for both of us. But yeah, as you can see, this deck really just has to win with the Gajira Boot DekloTanz combo, because if you're playing 40 cards and you need to have like the adequate amount of removal to stabilize, you don't have a whole lot of room for deviating from that plan. Um, but I think we did a pretty good job of making a deck that could stabilize early, focuses on its win condition, executes it pretty consistently when it's given the time to do so. I know Spencer wasn't an early believer in this deck, but once he saw the loop, he was like, "Oh yeah, I'm into this." It's like it's just fun to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, decks like this in the past. I mean, we've put together, quote unquote rub decks in the past, the classic rub, if you will, when they were 50 and 54 and 58 cards with the DekloTanz loop. It was just an added benefit of being in these colors, and we could just make our decks as big as we wanted, and we were bad at the game, so why not have it and do it when we had four Coreals and we played the deck with surfers and God, whatever else we used to
Yeah,
do back then. So, this DekloTanz just basically said, "Hey, I'm gonna do that, but I'm just gonna be that." And it took me a while to get on board with it, but I like it a lot more now. We ran a deck like this with Nature, I think originally,
oh yeah, I tried
and
that.
yeah, Soul Swap just didn't do for this deck what I think we wanted it to. We ended
Yeah,
up with a lot of dead weight in Bronze Arm Tribe and
yeah.
some
Swap
of
is
the other
good,
nature
but
cards
like
we were trying to run.
in
But
our
yeah,
format again, there's only 2 swaps, and it just wasn't really worth the added bloat and the weird mana turns. You know, for
yeah,
some reason, you play 40 cards, and these 4 color decks get kind of weird sometimes early on. And
yeah,
then, who knew Slash Charger and Volcano Charger were cards? You can just ramp without playing Bronze Arm Tribe.
yeah.
Even though, like, sometimes I ironically say, like, Bronze Arm's the best card in the game because ramp is so busted. But, like, Volcano Charger does a thing in ramps, and you get your turn 6 a little bit early, or you can slash into wave. Like, there's a lot of cool progressions this deck has that make it not quite as slow as it would appear.
Well, Slash Charger hitting your Gajira boot too was just a
You
key
can do that, yeah.
thing, and
Yeah, if
we
you have
talked about that in the
Tanzanite,
deck.
it's another memory.
Yeah,
Nope.
so DekloTanz just all of a sudden became very viable, and it felt good. And yes, you'll see it more as we get into this bracket.
And what is
But
it up
that will bring us
against?
now to Fire Water Rush, which was at rank 14 down here. But
This
we
was your
moved it
baby.
to, yeah, we moved it to, we removed Light Fire, which we came to, I guess, the consensus that it might be the weakest of the three rush decks,
So yeah, it
just in
moved up
terms
one slot, really. It's like pretty close to
of.
where it originally was ranked.
So we ended up deciding which rush we wanted to take out. That ended up being Light Fire. So we moved Fire Water into that slot. And Fire Water, the whole point of this was now with the new ban list, this deck wasn't really affected by it at all in terms of just it was playing. But I really wanted to play Hyper Squid Walter. I wanted Walter and I wanted Unicorn Fish to be good. So that's where this list ended up landing. Unfortunately, because better judgment took I don't know. I listened to Christian, and we ended up
Unfortunately.
taking out we ended up taking out a few Walters and a fourth Unicorn Fish to play cards like Lucky Ball and max out Spiral Gate.
Oh, I
And
also
so
don't
that's
have
where
an updated list here, but you do have an updated profile. I think Comet Missile got cut last minute for Rickaboo the Dismantler.
yeah, Missile got cut for Rickaboo the Dismantler, and that's his. Yes,
Yeah.
I think that is the only other change to this deck. So, it relies on Paladin. It does the whole thing like it normally did in the fast. It's just meant to be a more tempo-y rush deck. And so that's why it ended up getting included over Light Fire, because Light Fire was just the run face until turn 4, hope you win. And if you're not winning on 4, you're hoping you're winning on 5. And if you're not winning on 5, you're probably not winning. Fire
Yeah.
Water felt like it gave you more turns to win, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying it, because you always had the out of guard into paladin, or Lucky Ball to bring you back into the game to reload. So that's why this deck ended up getting included over the other one. And
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, tempo based rush deck. So
Yeah, I
a
thought
lot of
I definitely think a paladin deck should have
roll.
made the thing, and like we briefly considered water nature, but it seemed a little
Yeah,
too weak overall. So it was nice to include this to have paladin represented in a deck.
yeah, yeah. The water nature version will probably see play if we end up doing more bracket tournaments in the future. I think we actually ended up landing on a list after we started the bracket tournament that I think we generally liked. Um, but
Maybe
yeah, it'll,
we'll
it'll yeah,
we'll see.
maybe. Yeah, yeah, who knows? It might just be
Let us
weak,
know
but
down below if you made it this far and you really want to see Lancer Bark
right,
Whip Paladin.
it's
Yeah.
a fun tempo deck. So that brings us to our second version of Rub.
Oh boy, the
This deck
classic.
saw, yeah, this deck saw quite a bit of changes. Let's see if we
Is the list right or the picture right? The picture is
the
wrong.
the picture
Picture looks
is
right.
right. The
Yeah,
picture is right.
that's a
Yeah,
blessing.
so the picture is right here. You're welcome. Um, so this list, Christian originally wanted Typhoon, Clone Nightmare, but
Okay, I'll
after a little
clarify
bit of
that statement really quick. Some slander. Christian originally wasn't super interested in this deck because I was busy thinking about DekloTanz loops. It was dominating my headspace. But I was like, wait a minute. If you Typhoon into Clone Nightmare, it kind of looks like a Cranium Clamp, and it
but on turn three.
but on turn
Turn
3.
turns out less than 5% of the time that strategy will actually happen just based on the way you can draw cards with 8 cards and 40 and seeing
True.
Typhoon on 2
The theory
and
there
Clone
though was
Nightmare
that
with
like
Protect 7. So
Typhoon is not that awful later. It does cycle for
no,
very very
no,
very cheap.
and looking back at it, I think versions of this deck I would like to try in the future might still run Clone Nightmare, but might run one or two Typhoons because I like Typhoon later, and it might just be a better energy stream depending on what you're trying to look at doing. But it's just this deck is just your classic take on Rub, and I
Yeah.
felt like it needed to be included just because of the way we've played it on the channel in the past.
For me, I
Bomidius
think I
wanted
realized
to see
quickly that
play,
I sort
and
of
this was
didn't.
the deck that ran it. So
Yeah. The more classic finisher lineup. I and you actually attack with this deck. I don't know. I think you could also just play like super classic and just go back to, all the four locos, add a Lost Solar too, and call that your discard instead of Clone Nightmare, which often is
yeah,
just feeling bad as a Ghost Touch. Often even
right.
Ghost Touch is better, but I mean, yeah, this deck does it does the more traditional game plan of controlling. It runs Aqua Hulkus for that board presence. It's like one of the only Aqua Hulkus decks.
Yeah,
There
it's
are very
wild,
few. Yeah, it's like
right?
this Water, Fire, Rush, and Marino.
Light water, water, fire. Yeah,
Yeah, very few
yeah,
decks with Aqua Hulkus here.
yeah,
But yeah, this is gave you an opportunity to play that Galk Life Dragon that was a tech we stole from the overseas metas, which is
yeah,
sick.
yeah. It's you needed something to do with Patrova, man, and this
Yeah,
deck does that, or just they get a pal on board and don't have another one yet. And Gawk like deals with that, and hopefully any other light things that are on board. But
yeah. What
yeah,
did
Rub
this?
is just Rub is Rub. I don't know that I want to get into the paint with what this deck is. We have deck profiles for it, but
Yeah,
it felt like it needed to be here and needed to be represented. I think in the
yeah,
future we'll probably limit different decks that see these tournaments if we continue to do this in the future. But
yeah. We couldn't
um,
tell which rub deck was like just actually better, and we had 16 slots, so we decided we would include both. But now I
and
think
it
we've learned a
worked
little bit more,
out
and
to
both of
where if
these
they
rated
both
high.
yeah,
Like we
and
we
if
thought
both
both
of
these were
them
good.
won their first match, they would play each other, and then we'd really get to know.
Yeah.
So that was a neat thing that might have happened.
And moving on, it was up against Hydrooze in round one, the
Deck
round
that
of
does play
16.
Aqua Hulkus.
Oh, it does. It's like the fourth Aqua Hulkus deck, yeah, and it should
Yeah.
play Hulkus. That's correct. It's correct of it to do so.
This
Uh,
deck is just
love Hydrooze, dude.
yeah, it's the definition of tempo. It rated low, and I think that's just because we were high on a lot of other decks at the time. Um, Hydras is just it defines tempo to me. It's what tempo is in Duel Masters. Lets you do all the things. Still has solid discard packages with Locomotive, or this version of it ran Clamp. I think in future iterations, Zombie Carnival needs to see play.
Yeah, we
Illusionary
didn't
Mortal.
realize Zombie Carnival was so good, but as you'll see in a couple other decks that are playing it, we realized that like, hmm, There's less Merfolk ability in this deck for sure, because
Yeah.
there's only really Emerald leading up to it. But more than that, it's like if I want the
Well,
cards in my hand,
I was all for, but yeah.
true, true. If you go perfect progression, yeah, Merfolk is pretty good on 5. But like if my board is dead, that's when I want the cards, right? If I have a great board, then I don't really need to draw more cards. It's when I need to reload. And if I have no board, then Merfolk is dead and Zombie Carnival is fantastic, because that means my board is in the trash and I can get my board back.
Right, and Zombie Carnival just, and again, to speak on a card that this deck won't be playing in the future videos you see with it, but Zombie Carnival on 5. If they've if you have 5 mana and you Zombie Carnival because they've been killing a lot of your things and you're just sort of in that top deck mode, you can get back. You can call Hedrian and get back Propeller Mutant, Hydrooze, and a Dormel or a Loco. If it's the Cyberlord piece, you can get back Corile, a couple Emeralds, Hydrooze. Hydrooze can come back no matter which way you call it with its bait. And because there's 2 drops on both sides of that, Zombie Carnival with 5 mana means that you should just be able to play Hydrooze on 6 as long as
Yeah.
they don't discard. So that's
And
just
often the thing
a
that makes it
neat
even
line
better
that
is
the deck
sometimes it's
can do.
free.
Right. So, it's just this deck gives you a lot of really neat lines that are all very consistent and feel good. And that's not something I think a lot of the other tempo decks can do or say. Because of the rest of the supporting cast. You get what 14 shield triggers in Loco,
Yeah.
Pit, Surfer, and Spiral Gate. 18 if you're playing Zombie Carnival.
Yeah.
Aqua
And
Hocus just gives you consistent draw otherwise. It's
it's like the
just the
cheapest
deck just does
evolution
all.
too. And like when you play Hydras, it buffs the other stuff. So between the shield triggers and the fact that on turn 4 potentially you're buffing your 2 drops, it trades really well against other aggressive strategies. Like Hydras kills the Gaunt, the Emerald kills the Bronze Arm for free because of the Hydras buff. And like you hit one shield trigger and you're just like in the money against something else aggressive.
Yeah. And it just, like I said, the deck just feels good and it's everything tempo wants to be. And I think we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
So what does that bring us to?
That brings us
We are
to
now
the
in
bottom half of the bracket. For the deck we rated second overall, the Faux Bombazar Water Fired Nature
and
Tempo,
this
I
deck.
believe.
So I don't know. I love Faux Bamba. Shout outs to Spencer for naming it that. It's always just been water, nature, fire, water, fire, nature, tempo. But um, this deck, and I think we might have mentioned it at the top. Running a lot of big guys, in this deck with the lack of, well, with having your halving HAF, I don't know, V whatever, soul swap, as now these big dudes aren't doing what you want them to consistently, and
That
because of the limitedness and how we're sorry, the cats are doing something wild in the background. um because of what they're doing, because they're limited to 40 and they're not playing as many blockers, all of a sudden Windax, and this was maybe the realization that you had a week or two ago that gave it to me, was Windax isn't as strong as it used to be. We were jamming 4 of Thrash Crawlers and Taj Mahals, and we
Yeah,
used to
back
run
in the
the
day, like the way we beat
water
aggressive
blocker,
decks,
Drilling Fish, yeah.
yeah,
So
we just played as
you
many
know,
blockers as possible. We thought that was it's the most obvious way to beat an aggressive deck, but it's not always the best. So we looked
right.
at a lot of these overseas decks that where this is still a very, very popular and strong archetype, but they're playing like 1 or 2 Windax a lot of the time. And a lot
Right.
of that's because the blocker count is lower, and a lot of the blockers are Juliana, which is not Windaxable. So you did eventually go down to 3 before the bracket tournament, and you put in the 4th Quixotic Hero for 8
Yeah.
2 drops. Because again, another thing we noticed was that a lot of them are running like 9 or 10 2 drops, maybe even like maybe 11 sometimes. I don't know, but like the odds that you, in my opinion, I don't think you're winning a whole lot of the time that you miss turn 2 with this deck unless you're up against something very slow. I know the double breakers do a lot of lifting, but boy is it nice to hit a 2, especially if you lose the die roll and you don't hit a 2. It's like oof, that's gonna be rough.
And I mean, like you said, this deck is strong, I think, on paper, and it always has been. But it's just one of those strategies that maybe, as we get more into this, as we look at some of these other decks, especially the one that this one's up against, this deck, I think, needs refinement, and it needs to hit its curve properly in order to succeed. And like you mentioned, going to 9 to 10 2 drops is probably where this deck wants to stay. Um, seen consistencies in Jigalzor, in Twin Cannon late is something this deck needs, and with Soul Swap at 2, it just can't do that consistently. I think the inclusion of Zebrafish, just a card that I've always loved, and just the strategy where if you can knock him down to 0 shields, Zebrafish off the top with Supersonic Jetpack and the mana wins the game. Like, while that's cute, because of the lack of blockers and maybe even taking out Windax now, like, it just probably doesn't need to be part of the deck and should just be running things that help it accomplish its goal more consistently, which is its
Yeah.
2 into 3 into 5 into 7. So,
You can really
you
tell.
know,
I didn't think about this until you said it, but you can really tell based on the way this deck is built, and especially the way it was built even before the changes for this tournament. Like, you can tell that in our localized meta, we were playing a lot of dirtily shit, you know? Because you didn't care about missing turn 2. Even on the draw, you could just, like, start with Aquahulkus on turn 3 against the slow control decks, and you'll just have the double breakers and the Zebrafish later to close. It didn't matter. But yeah, we played a lot of more aggressive mid-rangey and tempo decks in this particular bracket tournament.
yeah, and this deck wants to be able to compete with those, which brings us to your baby. This is why it ranked as low as it did is probably right, but man, Phantomach, what a deck!
Yeah, let me bring it up real quick. Let me see. So it did. Yeah, this was ranked 15th on the bracket, right? Because Zebrafish was the second overall.
Yeah,
Yeah. So this was a deck. I cannot remember the name of the YouTube channel, but I just happened to see it on YouTube while looking at overseas metas and stuff. And it won enough of when I retooled it for our like 40 card format and made a couple changes because Clamp is at 1, etc. in what we're doing. Oh, there is one change to this. The Pyrofighter became the 4th Palo Oasis. Sorry about that. Besides that, the deck is how we ran it in the bracket tournament. But it won enough of our, I guess, pre-seeding games, our pre-season, as you could say, before we ranked the decks. It won enough of those to where I could convince Carl and Spencer and Gorby to add it to the bracket, even though it ranked
yeah,
15th.
yeah. Well, I mean, this deck was right there with Pegasus. I think I'd put a Worms deck together that we'll probably post on the channel at some
Yeah,
point
you
when we.
bet me a whole dollar that Worms would beat it in a best of 7, and I gotta say Worms got crushed because that's never gonna
Oh
get
my
posted.
god. Yeah. No, Worms got
I knew it
annihilated,
was
and
gonna happen.
I began to realize, like, okay, like, turns out these mid-range strategies with these, like, not dirtle cards, but just cards that you don't want to kill are a problem. Especially like a 4 for 4,000 Rothus that kills something else on the way in is just
Yeah,
it's an issue. It's hard to deal with. Simian Warrior Grash is just annoying. Like,
yeah,
this deck's one of the weird ones where your only 2-drop being Kamikaze makes it feel like this deck should just lose to anything faster than it. But then it has just cards like Palolesis and Kalan, and
and
those
cards
cards just
like
deal with things on
18
turn.
shield
Yeah.
triggers.
18 shield triggers is a lot of shield triggers. So,
Yeah,
this deck all of a sudden had like ways to like deal with its discrepancies in other areas by dealing with them in different ways. And it's such a unique deck that I'm glad we included. And, looking back, maybe it got ranked a little lower than it needed to, but
I put it at
I
like
just
14 personally,
sure.
which is still
But
pretty low.
it's just one of those dark horse decks where Phantomach is just hard to deal with. And
Yeah, the
it's
theory
and
is
it's
the card
large.
quality is bad, but like when you drop Phantomach, all of Kamikaze, Chainsaw Ming, and Double Breaker, all of a sudden it's a good card.
Yeah. This deck's ability to alpha strike is wild. And it's like you said, the preseason games we played it with, I think it ended up beating a control deck.
Yeah,
I
it
know
beat DekloTanz. I'm pretty
it
sure,
beat yeah,
or
it beat
someone. It beat one of the
Declotan.
rubs. It
It
beat
beat one
Phal.
of the other tempo strategies that we played, and all of a sudden it was just like, okay, maybe this deck's a lot better than we're giving it credit for, and it's cards that are hard to deal with. So, and
Yeah.
all of them do something that's annoying. So, shout outs to Phantomach.
Of course, it being ranked 15 means it has to play against one of the decks that we've been playing for the longest time, which is the Water Fire Nature deck we just talked about. So stay tuned.
Right.
Deck profiles and matches for both of those coming.
Yeah.
What is
Then we get into
next?
Deckout, which we described a lot at the top of this, which I
Yeah, I
don't
already
think
showed him
needs
that
any
list.
further.
Yeah,
Yeah, it doesn't need any further explanation. Go back to some of the timestamps early if you want to talk about it. I'm sorry, the cats are fighting.
as they
Um,
do.
That's what all the brawling is in the background, just cats annihilating each other.
Up
But yeah, so go
to
back to, we'll have timestamps for this. Just go click on them if you somehow clicked ahead and didn't get to hear about Deckout. But
yeah.
that'll take us to like Dark Nature Totem, which in this matchup, uh somehow like one of the more like dark horse decks against Deckout, because Deckout loses one of two ways. It either just doesn't have stuff that it can kill, so like DekloTanz can just Gajira boot a bunch of things until it can manage to stick one dude that can swing in, or
Oh, I have to
it
say before you go on, the upside down card in this list is Pincer Scarab, because
yes.
we identified that card. I'm gonna take a little bit of credit and say I was browsing random Duel Masters cards, and I was like, this card seems pretty good in our format. And then I realized that like overseas they actually do play it in a lot of things. So
Yeah,
we came to the
it
same
is just a
conclusion. I was just several years late.
large 4 drop. Yeah.
But anyway, that's what that is. So back to
Right.
Deckout.
So, but yeah, back to Deckout versus this in the matchup. Theory stated that, okay, so Deckout can win by going wide, but the things that it can't kill going wide are anything over 3 to 4,000 power. And guess what two Palo Elises do when they both end up on the board? They make all of the wide removal ineffective. So theory with this, because Gorby and I ended up playing this match, and you'll get to see how it goes. No spoilers, but turns out if you dirtle, the idea being is that if you just don't do anything for 7 to 8 to 12 turns, and you drop a Petrova and two Palo Elisis at the same time, you should just be able to do whatever you want from there. Deckout's only strategies at that point are to Hopeless Vortex and Terror Pit the Palace, because they have to get rid of them. But at that point, everything is still big and the wide removal doesn't do anything. So, just a really interesting concept of this deck versus Deckout. But, Totem on paper just has all of the big dudes, which is why it's defined as mid range, because everything it plays on curve should just be the largest thing on board at any given point. So,
Yeah, except for like
I don't know.
Mystrios, but it is the only Petrova deck we included in the bracket,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And it's good
Yeah.
to represent that. And honestly, we should maybe think about, a couple Petrova decks next time, because Petrova's a beating. Petrova's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Petrova's hard to deal with, which is what the inclusion of Gawk Life was in Rub, and then all of this wide removal Blizzard of Spears just saw a lot more play in a lot of the fire control deck strategies. I think Blizzard sees play in almost all of them, if not all of them, um, because of cards like Petrova being an issue, because of things going wide where you need to deal with multiple Ganta, or in Phantomach's case, Gagapi Ponto. So killing all of the wide removal that's expensive.
Yeah,
So I think my cats are fighting, and I'm gonna go check on that really quick because one of them might have just fallen down the stairs. So I'm gonna
that's
go do that,
hilarious.
and Christian's gonna tell you guys about Marinomancer. I'll be right
I'm
back.
gonna tell you about Marinomancer. I don't know if he can still hear me, but I feel like cats just fight, and he's just let it happen and see who comes out on top. They'll probably be fine, right? I've seen his stairs. They're not, well, hopefully they're fine. All right, moving on. We have Marinomancer, which we actually rated at number 3 overall.
Fine.
Are they okay?
Yeah, no, I just need to make
Called it.
sure they didn't throw themselves down the stairs. So,
Oh,
because that's what it
jeez.
sounded like just a moment ago.
Anyway, Marinomancer, we rated at number 3. One of the decks we have played a bunch over the years. We landed on a version that I think we liked quite a bit. One of the stronger versatile decks that exists. Not quite a control deck, but it can definitely play very defensively very well against aggro decks, and then turn the tides as soon as it drops a Crazed Valkyrie. The Marinomancer is an incredible tool for keeping cards in your hand, so this deck really does have like a lot of ways to maintain an advantage in cards on the board and in hand. And some cards we recently discovered were quite good, like Miraculous Snare as a 2 of in here and everything. We actually like we're very worried about Wave Strikers in general, which might have been obvious or might not have been in a couple of the other decks, but like that's kind of why like not only the 2 snares but like the Colons with the Melnias and everything, we needed answers for like 6,000 power 3 drops and stuff. But yeah, generally I mean, this is just a solid all-around deck. I know overseas it's less popular, to play something quite like this with the Craze and the Marinos, and they tend to go the Hydro Hurricane route, and that's something that I feel like we'll probably put together and test next time we get together. But for the sake of this, we had already done the last minute mana burn inclusion, and we just felt like keeping our light water dark entry something that we sort of knew how to play and knew its matchups a little bit better made
Yeah.
sense to us.
You mentioned just fighting against wave strikers. Like Marino saw that early removal to deal with all of the other tempo strategies. Phantomach was already proving to be an issue in, as you mentioned, our preseason. Faux Bomba, that Melnia is just your answer to almost everything in that deck. Um, Survivors dealing with a lot of the early turn stuff, having cards like Melanie and Snare to deal with those big evolutions when they hit the board. If you don't have Pit, it's just that Marinomancer had all the answers for those decks, but then it just played better than most of the controls because it had better draw and the better finisher in Crazed Valkyrie. This is the Crazed Valkyrie deck in this tournament. Starnoid, yes, played one, but it
Two.
was more of its secondary engine. Marino relied on Valkyrie. That's what it was curving to. We got rid of the Blue Mercus because it was just too slow and didn't do what the rest of this deck already did better. So,
Yep.
Marino was just a strong version, and it always has been. You guys have seen it in previous iterations throughout this channel's history, and Marinomancer, just this is the version we decided to go with here.
Yep, solid deck, and it was up against the Mana Burn, which again we've already talked about earlier in the video. So if you want to hear how we made that last minute inclusion and some of the interesting things about it, that'll be timestamped like way earlier. So just like hover over the thing and get there.
For
What's
sure. And
next?
that'll take us to the very last matchup, which is Fire Nature Rush versus Survivors. We talked about a lot about Survivors just kind of on and off throughout this discussion video. Survivors is the the engine is those 20 cards. It is the Factory Shell, Grave Worm, Blazosaur, Smash Horn. That's the core of the deck. We're culminating in playing a Qtronic that just swings for a million shields. But the other 20 cards in this deck are purely toolbox. You build it for the meta. So Christian and I had a conversation prior to this tournament of, do we see what this deck's matchups are for the first, potential, three decks that it's going to play against? In this case, it would have been Fire
Oh, that
Nature
one's wrong.
Rush playing the winner of Marinomancer Mana Burn, or do we just play it as just an open field of what do we want to play it against? And that's kind of where we ended up landing with this
Yeah.
toolbox list of just playing the Tornado Flames, playing
Is
the.
this list right? Is the list in the picture different? I thought it was for a second, but I think I'm just going crazy. The picture is right, right?
The picture is right. Yes.
Okay. I didn't need to do the thing that you all just saw me do. But hey,
Yeah.
we're getting it back.
So we ended up playing the list in the picture. We tooled it to be able to kind of play against the rush matchups, but also just have answers for some of the other control things. Which is why Clamp and Ganta ended up being in here. It's just other big things that it can do later. And I think that was just wrong. I think looking back, this deck will need to get retooled again to just be more consistent to do what it wants to do. And then the rush matchup is just, it's always going to be tough for this type of deck because it doesn't have a lot of blasts and it doesn't have a lot of early defense. So, looking at future iterations of this deck, I think Burst Shot is a card that we severely underrated because it doesn't see play in any of these decks. I don't think we played Burst Shot in one of these deck
Oh
lists, and
yeah.
if anything, this is the deck that wants it. So
Yeah. Well, next bracket tournament, we promise you there'll be at least a burst shot deck. Gotta commit now.
right,
Yeah. And
and
so
then
that
there's
was
just
up
Fire
against.
Nature.
God, how did we somehow save the most boring deck for last? I'm kidding.
Because this is the deck we want to end on, because this deck has been the same since the channel started, and probably going to stay the same as long as we have it included. So
No way
yeah,
though, right?
just
Because
standard
we're
Fire Nature
actually
Rush.
we're looking at some weird, funky stuff to do to this. I thought.
We were. Pincer Scarab's a
Still
neat
looking.
idea
No,
for
not
decks
that.
like this.
The X Boom
Um,
stuff.
right. So that's the other stuff. Is X Boom is a IDC player. I think he's, if not the reason, most of the reason why Fire Nature Rush is ranked so highly in their channel. But cards like Volcanic Arrows, versus Comet Missile, based on just blocker metas, taking out Rickaboos Screwdriver and Comet Missile and Torcom being your flex spots, and putting
Yeah.
cards like Volcanic Arrows in, Kook Balloon. What was the other card? Which one am I not remembering right now?
Engineer Kipo for that control.
Depot. Yeah. Yeah. So,
Pretty sick
a lot
stuff.
of interesting ways to put this deck together, with flexing out 2 or 3 of the slots depending on what you think you're going to be up against and, what's going to
Yeah.
be viable. So,
I'll say though, if you're up against a bunch of 50 card plus control decks that run 16 blockers and none of them are Yuliana, this is the version of the deck that gets you there for sure. Like maybe you don't
yeah.
need Torcon, but like you need the screwdrivers and the missiles. But I totally get why, especially after having played all these different decks that are not as bad as we used to play them. I get the why people are playing things like Volcanic Arrows and Engineer
Yeah.
Kipo and other 2-drops instead, and
Well,
I think they're very
Snip
cool.
Striker. Yeah, Snip Striker being a 2 for 3,000 power creature with Yuliana being as much of a presence as it is over there, I can see why Snip Striker sees play. Um,
Yeah, Poisonous Mushroom. I mean, I'm still on
Poison.
the fence about that, but I'm interested. Like, I feel like we should. I feel like when we inevitably include this deck again, I'm not going to spoil how anything went for this bracket tournament, but I feel like there might be some changes just to see how they go. You know.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah,
For
it
sure.
wins really fast when it wins. So
Yeah,
like
it does.
always.
I mean, this is the deck that there's a meme out there of the child who drew the horse, and it's the very descript and beautiful version of like the backside of the horse, and it's like rush turns 1 through 4, and then turns 5 through whatever is just the very crude drawing of it. Looks like a 2-year-old drew a horse. So
Yep.
yeah, it's a good meme, and that's because it's true. Turns 1 through 4 is where this deck thrives, and if this deck is still playing the game after 4, it's probably because it's not winning.
So yeah, that pretty much is that's all 16 decks that we elected to include in the first ever Duel Masters 2023 Channel Earth Power bracket tournament. Finding the best finding aw beans. If
Yeah.
only Spencer was here. Finding the best deck in the Finnish format of Duel Masters, which again is on screen, and we will link to the shorter video and all of the 16 deck profiles that are coming your way in the coming days and weeks.
Yeah, so hope you guys
yeah.
enjoyed. Don't know if you guys stuck around this long, but if you're still here, you're the realest. Appreciate you guys, love you guys, and stay tuned for some actual match content. I think the stuff that you guys actually come here for those of you who are still here.
Some of you are here for a podcast, and that's what you got today.
Yeah. Well, hope you guys enjoyed. Check out the link below to get a list of how the meta is for us, the ban list, and stay tuned for deck profiles and some of these matches coming up here soon. We'll catch you guys next time. Christian, any closing thoughts?
Nope. It's been an hour, so I think if we haven't covered it, it wasn't worth covering.
Fair enough. We'll catch you guys next time.
Peach. Oh my god. I wasn't.
What?
I wasn't recording.
Really?
Yep.
This whole time. That's tough, man.
I'm just kidding. That was, and I kept this part in. I just wanted. I'm just memeing. We did it. It's a video.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know me, man. I'm around for hour-long content whenever you are, so let's fucking run it back.
YouTube, he would have made me re-record this. That's what we discovered.
Yeah, absolutely. That's your fault.
This is abusive. Channel editors being abused over here. This is an unpaid gig. All right, I'm turning off the video now. Hope you enjoyed the video.
Hey,
if you stuck around to the end, you get some comedy.